I'm delighted to be here and so forth and so on. I'm going to do three things. Originally, this was supposed to be an interview, so I'm going to set it up so that you can interview me. I'm going to talk about my own personal singularity for a couple of minutes, for those of you who haven't heard my news. Then I'm going to talk about genetics and those issues, mostly simply to set up a Q&A session, which I will moderate. So my own personal singularity is I'm about to spend 6 months in Russia training to be an astronaut as a backup. And the deal is I don't get to go. I'm just a backup. I'm backup to Charles Simoni, who went in April of 2007 and liked it so much he's going again. But he has the $40 million to do that, and I don't, so I'm going to back him up. The training, by all accounts, is going to be exciting, challenging, probably often painful. The Russian Space Agency is very Russian. I get 3 months off my training because I already speak Russian and I'm familiar with the culture. So it's going to be both horrible and wonderful, like all singularities. And I'm going into it with some trepidation. I don't really know what's going to happen. I know it's going to be this sort of battle of wills between me and the Russians, and they're going to win. But at the same time, I wanted a change, and I think I will win too, in some form or other, which I do not understand. It's unknowable. But I hope on March 26th, or March 25th, when I watch Charles head off into the sky, I'll be glad I've done it, and I'll come back changed forever. So, second thing, let me talk a bit about genetics. Earlier this week, before I went to Houston to have the colonoscopy that I didn't want to have done in Moscow, I spent a day with the Personal Genome Project. This is a project in which 10 people are having their genomes sequenced, and as far as I know, it's now up online, along with a fair amount of my health records. And the theory is my health records are an open book. Frankly, they're a lot more personal than my genome. My genome is what I got. My health record, one way or another, shows what I did with that genome. And you can't be ashamed or proud of your genome. You can be very ashamed or proud of what you did with it. So health records to me are dicier. They're also actually harder to collect. The genome's all in one place. Your health records are everywhere. The goal of the Personal Genome Project is, of course, it's in some sense it's a publicity stunt, as well as a research project to see what happens when people put their genomes up online, talk about them publicly. Do bad things happen to them? Do their family members get upset? Of course, we were supposed to talk to our family members beforehand, and I kind of did. My father, as you know, is a scientist, and the rest of my family is fairly geeky too, so they all thought it was great. But it's intended to provoke conversation. It's also intended to make people think, wow, the genome isn't that scary. It's not as edgy as it looks. We're mostly normal people, and so forth. I'm also a director of 23andMe, which is a direct-to-consumer personal genome company. We don't require you to publish your genome to other people. In fact, you can keep it as private as you want, but you can also share to whatever extent you want with family members or with a broader public. We spent a huge amount of time making this stuff intelligible at the same time as we wanted to make it obviously medically correct and also not upset the priesthood of the medical community that really thinks people aren't capable of understanding their genomes for themselves. They aren't really capable of understanding their genomes for themselves now because they don't know anything. And our goal is to, number one, be educational as well as profitable and help people understand. You can't really understand genetics if you don't understand probability and statistics. You also need to understand that genetics is not everything. There's how these genes interact, there's environment, there's all kinds of stuff. As I said, your genome is what you got, but then in the end, your health record, your phenotype ends up being the culmination of lots of interacting forces. People don't quite understand that. There's this, oh, will I find out when I'm going to die or what I'm going to die of? And it's only probabilities. Yet at the same time, the more we know, the better we can assess those probabilities and make better and better predictions. And that is what, to some extent, is scaring everybody. Anyway, 23andMe, very different. We moved 10 times as fast as the Personal Genome Project. I gave my blood, I think, in April of 2007. And the PGP is just now publishing my data. 23andMe does it in a matter of weeks. So it's different, but they're two parts of the same thing, if you like. And I'm doing both of them for the same reason, which is I think this stuff matters and I want to understand it. So let me talk about that just a little bit. And since I don't know how much you guys know, I'm going to try and be brief and leave the rest of it to questions. But right now, imagine you know 90 words of Russian. You go to Moscow, there are signs all over the places, there are things to read. All you know is those 90 words. You can figure a certain amount out, but whether you look at a restaurant menu with 150 words or you look at all of Moscow, all you've got is those 90 words. That's really where we are with the genome right now. You can do millions and millions of base pairs, but you still just got 90 words of understanding. So it's kind of like having 90 words. You can't read War and Peace, even if you get it. But of course, over time, you can take those 90 words and start leveraging them, applying them to all the War and Peace data that comes in. So the data now has a huge amount of meaning, but we can't interpret it. Over time, that meaning will become clear. We'll understand not just the genes themselves, but how the genes interact. We'll understand genomics. We'll understand environmental factors. We'll do that using data collected by 23andMe, using data inspired by the Personal Genome Project. And we will know a huge amount, which is, of course, both exciting and scary. The benefits are clear: personalized medicine, better therapies. If some people think this is not a benefit, but the equivalent of amniocentesis, you can figure out if a baby is going to have a lot of problems, and then as parents you can make the decision whether or not to have an abortion. And again, we're getting, some people think that itself is evil. You get much better therapies. All these things you could call ameliorative or remediation. Then you get the question of, well, do we have the right to improve on humanity rather than simply fix it? And of course, the definitions of both of those are the big issue here. Beyond those specific questions, information is scary. New information is scary. We have long-standing myths, the apple of the tree of knowledge. You learn a little bit and you get kicked out of paradise. There are lots of stories that I love about evil mirrors, or evil people looking into evil mirrors and seeing their souls portrayed. The picture of Dorian Gray was actually a picture, not a mirror, but it's sort of the same idea. You can consider the picture of Dorian Gray to be his genome or something like that. But people are scared at looking at themselves. This is new stuff, particularly scary. And that's an emotional, visceral reaction. People, with some justification, also say, well, no, I'm not talking about that weird stuff. I'm talking about specific things like genetic discrimination and so forth and so on. There's a new law in the United States called GINA, which in theory takes care of that. I'm not sure it does. There is, you could say, well, if we just had better health insurance, it wouldn't be an issue. Whatever, let's not talk about that. We don't have time. There are two, I think, huge issues that show up here. The first is personalized medicine is really great. You have a predisposition to something, you work better with one drug than another, you should get what you need. But what about personalized laws? Suppose you're susceptible to alcohol. Should you be governed by different regulations from people who are not? Should we start having differential laws? And you could say, well, of course not. And then people say, but society pays for these people who are sick or who abuse drugs or whatever. This to me is a really, that's where danger lies. And then the second one is this notion of breeding people. Suppose we started breeding or designing people. Suppose we designed prison guards to be especially mean and sadistic. Or suppose we designed prison guards to be nice people but with no ambition, so they'd be happy to be nice and be prison guards for the rest of their lives. The underlying evil here is the fundamental notion that people should not be bred for purposes other than their own fulfillment. They shouldn't be bred for other people. Some people think it's okay for children to be created for God. In many cultures, people do think it's okay for children to be created to take care of their parents in their old age. But to me, the notion that a person can fulfill anyone's destiny other than his own is the scary one. And with that, we have 10 whole minutes, I think, for questions, which should be the fun part. Okay, John Horgan? Great. I'm going to repeat the questions unless people speak really loudly.
Just wonder, you must know about the recent history of genetic therapy for inherited diseases. So this started in the early 1990s, and the last time I checked, it's been a complete disaster. I mean, it just hasn't worked at all. And so there's this gap between the diagnostics and the treatments that we're supposed to be getting. So I just wonder, now that you're getting your genome scanned, if you could talk about your feelings about the lack of treatments for anything that you might find out that you have.
Okay. Question I think you heard, genetic therapies for inherited diseases. I think the short answer is it's way too early to expect anything. I don't know of any serious project that has failed because I don't know of any serious project that has even been begun. Certainly people are looking at these issues, but there's a lot you can do with genetic engineering, which is not injecting new genes, but viruses are in fact a form of genetic interaction, if you like. The notion that you can insert new genes into things is completely plausible. So the question is, again, do we insert nice genes into mean people instead of throwing them in jail, whether or not they want us to? Yes?
I find it interesting that you chose the idea of engineering prison guards to be mean or nasty, because this is obviously something that's been in the news in the last 5 years, and also something which was the subject of one of the most famous psychological experiments of all time, which is that we don't need to engineer people's genes to make mean, nasty prison guards. We can use just any old genome and manipulate its environment, which seems much cheaper, easier, and simpler than manipulating people's genes to make them into mean, nasty prison guards. So I guess what I'm thinking is, compared to the potential for fairly crude manipulations of the environment, which seem intrinsically fairly reversible, does manipulating the genome seem actually that significant?
Does manipulating the genome seem
even that significant compared to the fairly crude manipulations of the environment, which seem reversible but have big effects, as we all know?
Okay, I'll try and repeat the question as I answer it. I don't know, did you hear it in the back? Okay. Oh, it was a great question. It began, so I find it interesting you talk about engineering prison guards, since they've been in the news a lot lately, and absolutely the case. Why do we need to engineer them to be mean and nasty when that's already been done for us, and so forth? And then I guess the question really was, can't we just do this with environment rather than through genetic engineering? And presumably you meant make them nicer rather than make them meaner. There's a frustration if you really wanted the world to be a nice place and nobody to kill anybody, you just kill all the people at once, and then there would be no bad people left. It's a very good question. You take somebody like the government of Singapore or something, and they're not waiting for genetic engineering, they're just trying social engineering. Again, some people find that creepy, some people find it wonderful. And my concern is that the government of Singapore or things of its ilk, will start trying genetic engineering instead. It's actually really, really hard to create consistent environments that make people nice. It's not as easy as you might think, though it's probably easier than... I don't know, I don't really know the answer because the question isn't terribly clear, but it's a very interesting thing to think about. Again, the implications of genetic engineering for character are probably... They're much, how shall we say, more unpredictable than simply genetic engineering for more easily defined traits. If you want to follow up, yeah. No. Because I'm not sure I give a satisfactory answer. It's a really tough question. Okay, great. Yes, absolutely.
Quick question then. What's the time frame, the number of new genetic words, to use that analogy, are being translated, and is that number increasing for you?
Yeah. Okay, this is great. This is a sort of factual question, which are much easier. The rate at which we're making so-called genetic discoveries is increasing. More people are working on it, more genetic data is showing up with more phenotypes to match it to. Understand, again, it's not that you say, oh, look, we found the gene for X, now we know. It's much more, now we have 3,000 people and with some condition or other or some trait, and we have a control group, and statistically, these guys with the trait also seem to have these 3 or 4 genetic markers. But we still need to figure out how controlling are those specific genes, how do they interact with the environment. How many of you noticed 3 weeks ago, Sergey Brin posted on his blog that basically his mother has Parkinson's. He found out that he had a marker for Parkinson's. And he said something that, if you don't know this stuff, sounded rather strange. He said, I know it increases my chance of having Parkinson's, but I don't know whether that percentage is 20% greater or 80% greater. And that sounds really, really vague. The issue is, if you look at for example, if you look at people in a family and you see that some people in the family have X and some don't, and some have X prime gene and some don't, and there seems to be a pretty strong correlation, you may say, wow, well, that gene clearly is very strongly correlated with the X prime condition. But it may be that those people also have a couple of other either genes or traits or environment that you didn't notice that increases the impact of that particular gene. So you can't, we think we have controls. We think ceteris paribus, everything else is the same other than the presence or absence of a particular genetic marker, but that's not necessarily the case. So the statistics are very complex, and understanding the interactions of all these things is extremely difficult. In the end, what we're talking about is the reality and the simulation become one if you have enough data. So thank you very much.